Welcome to Sleepy Love Tales, soothing romantic stories to help you relax and fall asleep. Let us know where you're listening from in the comments. If soft, heartfelt tales help you unwind, be sure to subscribe so you never miss a moment of calm. Now, let's begin tonight's story. The world had shrunk to the size of a window pane. Beyond the leaded glass, a thick white fog pressed in, erasing the line between the sea and the sky, swallowing the jagged peaks of the Kiraing that was supposed to be the main attraction. For 10 days the Isle of Skye had been nothing but a ghost of itself, a place of muted sounds and blurred edges. It suited Alessa's mood perfectly. Her husband, Marco, had called it a convalescence. "The clean air will do you good, my love," he'd said, his voice laced with the practical concern that had defined their marriage. "The city smog suffocates you. Go, breathe." But the air here wasn't clean. It was heavy, saturated with salt and damp and the smell of wet earth. It filled Alessa's lungs with the same oppressive weight that had settled on her spirit. The illness had receded, leaving behind a profound weakness, a weariness that seeped into her bones. Worse, it had stolen her words. The poet in her had gone silent, leaving only a hollow ache where rhythm and metaphor used to live. She sat in a worn armchair, a tartan blanket over her knees, and watched her neighbour. His cottage was a near-identical twin to hers, a squat stone building hunkered down against the wind, no more than 50 feet away. He was a myth wrapped in shadow, an American, the innkeeper had told her, a photographer, Elias. A name as solid and spare as the man himself. He moved with a heavy, deliberate stillness, as if the very air he displaced was a burden. Most days he would sit on his own porch, methodically cleaning the lenses of his camera, the brass and steel components gleaming even in the diffuse light. Then he would sling the worn leather strap over his shoulder and walk directly into the fog, disappearing completely. Hours later, he'd return, his dark hair slicked with mist, his jacket soaked, his expression unreadable. He never seemed to carry anything back but the camera on his chest. He moves like a man who has seen the end of the world, Alessa thought, her fingers tracing the rim of a cold teacup, and is in no hurry to find the beginning of a new one. I think I understand. The silence between their cottages was a living thing, punctuated only by the mournful cry of gulls and the distant rhythmic sigh of the waves against the cliffs. And sometimes another sound would cut through the quiet, the sharp metallic click of his camera's shutter. It was a sound of finality, of a moment captured and pinned down. She wondered what he found to photograph in the endless featureless grey. Was he too documenting the void? On the 11th day, a restless energy propelled her from her chair. She wrapped a thick wool shawl around her shoulders and stepped onto the small stone porch, leaving the cottage door ajar. The damp air was a shock, instantly chilling her skin. She breathed it in, a shallow, careful breath that ended in a familiar betrayal. A tickle, then a rasp, then a full-body rattling cough. It seized her, doubling her over the porch railing. Her lungs burned, tears pricking her eyes. She fought for breath, each gasp ragged and loud in the profound quiet. When the spasm finally subsided, she was left trembling, leaning against the cold stone, utterly spent. And then she saw him. He had emerged from the fog so silently he might have sprung from the earth itself. He stood a few feet away, a ghost in the mist, holding a simple glass of water. He offered it to her without a word, his expression obscured by the gloom, but his gesture was one of simple, unambiguous kindness. Alessa straightened up, embarrassed, and took the glass with a shaky hand. "Thank you," she managed, her voice a hoarse whisper. She drank, the cool water soothing the raw fire in her throat. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. His face was all harsh lines and angles weathered by sun and wind, his eyes a deep, startling blue, even in this colourless world. They held a profound, ancient weariness. "The damp gets in your bones here," he said. His voice was a low gravel, rough with disuse. The American accent was unmistakable, flattened by years away from home. You learn to live with it, or it swallows you whole. She handed the empty glass back to him, their fingers brushing for a fleeting second. His were cold, firm. "I am Alessa," she said, finding her voice. "My husband." He thought the air would help. She ended with a small, self-deprecating smile. "Elias," he replied. He didn't smile back. He just watched her, his gaze steady and intense, as if he were trying to find the right aperture to see her through. The fog swirled around them, a thick living curtain. For the first time since she'd arrived, Alessa didn't feel like it was isolating her. It felt like it was holding them together in a small shared pocket of the world. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the unspoken presence of another soul. He gave one last nod, then turned and dissolved back into the mist, leaving Alessa alone on the porch, the taste of clean water on her tongue and the echo of his voice in the air. The fog, as if by some unspoken agreement, began to recede. It didn't vanish entirely, but thinned into a gauzy veil, revealing a world of dramatic, sweeping beauty. The sky was a canvas of bruised purples and moody greys, and the sea, now visible, churned with a restless energy. The landscape was stark and primal, and for the first time, Alessa felt a flicker of something other than melancholy. It was awe. Feeling her strength slowly returning, she began to take short, hesitant walks along the cliff path. She never strayed far, her lungs still a fragile barometer of her exertion. On the third day of this new routine, she saw Elias emerge from his cottage, his camera, as always, his silent companion. He watched her for a moment as she navigated the muddy track, her steps uncertain. "There's a place," he called out, his voice carrying easily on the wind, "sheltered just a little further." She paused, surprised by the invitation. "I don't want to intrude on your work." He shook his head, a slight, almost imperceptible movement. "The ghosts don't mind." He started walking, and after a moment's hesitation she followed. He led her away from the cliff's edge, inland toward a shallow, green valley, where the skeletal remains of a village stood against the sky. It was a crofter's settlement, abandoned for a century or more, the stone walls of the cottages crumbling, their roofs long since surrendered to the elements. The wind whispered through the empty doorways, a lonely, keening sound. As they walked among the ruins, the silence between them began to fill with words. It started small. He asked about Italy. She asked about America. But soon the conversation deepened, drawn out by the profound solitude of their surroundings. "I feel like these stones," Alessa confessed, running her hand over the rough lichen-spotted wall of a roofless cottage. "Solid on the outside, but hollow within. My words, they have gone. It is as if the illness washed them all away, and I am left with nothing but silence." Elias was quiet for a long time, framing a shot of a single defiant thistle growing from a crack in a hearthstone. The click of the shutter was the only reply. Then he lowered the camera. "Words can be a lie," he said, his gaze fixed on the flower. "They dress things up, make them prettier or uglier than they really are. Sometimes the silence is more honest." He spoke guardedly about his work, calling it reportage. He never used the word war, but he spoke of places where the silence was a scream, where the dust was made of memories people wanted to forget. He spoke of Vietnam. He showed her how he saw the world, urging her to look through the viewfinder. The world shrank, became focused, intense. He had framed a shot of a fallen wall, the way the afternoon light caught the vibrant green moss clinging to it. Through his lens, it wasn't decay, it was tenacity. It was life persisting against all odds. "You photograph what is," she said, her voice filled with a newfound understanding, the hard truth of it. She looked around at the empty homes, at the ghosts he'd mentioned. "I write about the feelings left behind, the echoes. Perhaps they are the same thing." He didn't answer, but a different kind of silence settled between them, one of shared comprehension. She began to tell him stories, inventing lives for the families who had once warmed their hands by these cold hearths. She gave them names, sorrows, and simple joys, weaving tales from the shapes of the stones. He listened, his expression softening, the harsh lines around his eyes easing. She was lost in a story about a fisherman's wife waiting for a boat that would never return when she felt it. The slight shift in his posture, the quiet intensity of his focus on her. The camera was up. She froze, feeling suddenly exposed, vulnerable, but he didn't lower it. He waited, and in that moment, she understood. He wasn't stealing her image, he was asking for it. Slowly she relaxed, turning her face slightly toward the weak sunlight, letting him see what he wanted to see. Click. Later that evening there was a soft knock on her door. It was Elias. In his hands was a photograph, the paper still curling slightly, the chemical scent of the dark room clinging to it. It was her. She took it, her heart thudding a strange, unfamiliar rhythm. It was a portrait, but not like any she had ever seen. He had captured her in the ruins, her hair tossed by the wind, her face pale, but there was no trace of sickness in her eyes. Instead, he had found a flicker of the fire she thought had been extinguished. He'd seen the storyteller, the survivor. He had seen a strength she had forgotten she possessed. It was the most intimate, most honest gesture anyone had ever offered her. "I've spent years documenting destruction," Elias thought, as he walked back to his own dark cottage. He could still feel the warmth of her fingers where they'd brushed his. How do you photograph something being rebuilt? How do you photograph hope without it feeling like a lie? He looked back toward her cottage, where a single, warm light now burned against the encroaching twilight. The storm arrived without warning. One moment, the sky was a brooding canvas of grey. The next, the heavens opened. Rain fell not in drops, but in solid, wind-driven sheets, battering the small cottage. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, rattling the window panes in their frames. Alessa stood watching the sea, now a furious churning cauldron of white foam, when the lights flickered twice, then died, plunging the room into a deep, disorienting gloom. The cold crept in almost immediately. She was fumbling for matches to light the paraffin lamp when a sharp, insistent knock came at the door. It was Elias, a dark silhouette against the tumultuous grey of the storm, his jacket already plastered to his frame. "My fire is lit," he shouted over the roar of the wind. "It's warmer. Come." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, an offer of sanctuary. She grabbed her thickest shawl and followed him across the churning, muddy ground between their cottages. His cottage felt instantly different from her own. Where hers was tidy and impersonal, a rental space, his was intensely, chaotically his. Books were stacked on every surface, maps were pinned to the walls, and the air was thick with the rich, earthy scent of a peat fire that blazed in the hearth. And everywhere there were photographs, tacked to the walls spread across a large wooden table, clipped to a wire hanging across the room. They were stark black and white images of a world away from this misty island. A soldier's haunted eyes, a grieving mother's silent scream, a city street turned to rubble. It was a gallery of human suffering, captured with a devastating, unflinching honesty. The weight of his past was here, in this room, a silent, powerful testimony. The storm raged outside, sealing them in. The fire crackled and spat, casting dancing shadows on the walls, making the frozen faces in the photographs seem to flicker with life. The air between them was electric, charged with all the things they hadn't said. Forced into this raw proximity, there was nowhere left to hide. Alessa's gaze landed on one particular photo, set apart from the others on the mantelpiece. It was smaller, quieter, but somehow more devastating than the rest. It wasn't of a person, but of a single, worn-out child's shoe, half buried in the mud of a flooded road. "Tell me about this one," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Elias stared into the flames, his jaw tight. For a long moment she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and strained, stripped of its usual defences. "Vietnam," he said. "A village near the delta. We were moving through after a sweep. There was nothing left, just mud and silence. I saw the shoe and thought, that's the story. That's all that's left. So I took the picture." He paused, swallowing hard. "Then I saw her, the little girl, hiding in a ditch. She had no shoes. She was just staring at me." He finally turned to look at Alessa, his blue eyes shimmering in the firelight, raw with a pain that time had not touched. "They give you medals for watching," he said, his voice cracking, "for being invisible. But you're never invisible. You carry every face with you. I took the picture, and then I walked away. I was a vulture, picking over the bones." The confession hung in the air, heavy and raw. Alessa didn't offer him pity or empty platitudes. She offered him the only truth she had. "We all have our ghosts, Elias." She moved closer, her shoulder almost brushing his. "My husband, Marco, he's a good man. He loves the woman I was, the one who hosted dinner parties and laughed at all the right moments. But he's afraid of the woman I'm becoming, the one who is quiet, the one who is breaking. My great fear isn't dying. It's living a life that is only half lived, a beautiful, empty room." In that shared darkness, their separate pains found a common language. He saw her fear of fading away, and she saw his agony of having seen too much. He reached out, his calloused fingers hesitating for a fraction of a second before they gently, reverently, traced the line of her jaw. His touch was a question, a plea, a confession all at once. She leaned into his hand, her eyes closing. The raging storm outside was a distant echo of the tempest inside her. This was wrong, and yet it was the only thing that had felt right in months, perhaps years. It was inevitable. In the flickering firelight he leaned in and kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was desperate and deep, a collision of loneliness and longing. It tasted of salt and rain and peat smoke, a kiss born of storms both inside and out. It was the breaking of a long, painful silence, and in the shelter of his cottage, with the wind screaming outside, Alessa felt for the first time truly safe. The storm broke as suddenly as it had begun, leaving the island scrubbed clean, dripping and gleaming under a sky of impossible blue. The air was crystalline, and the sun, a rare and precious gift, poured down like liquid gold. It felt like the world had been remade, and in a way it had. The boundary they had crossed in the firelit darkness of Elias's cottage had changed everything. The tentative curiosity had been replaced by a current of intimacy that flowed between them, as tangible as the light breeze. An unspoken giddiness took hold, a feeling of joyful, reckless abandon. "We can't waste a day like this," Alessa said. Her face turned up to the sun, a genuine, radiant smile transforming her features. "It feels borrowed." "Then we should spend it well," Elias replied, the ghost of a smile touching his own lips. For one perfect sun-drenched day, they became tourists in their own temporary world. He drove them in his battered Land Rover, the windows down, the fresh, clean air whipping through the car. They were no longer the poet with no words and the photographer with no voice. They were just a man and a woman, alive and together under a brilliant sky. He took her to the fairy pools where the water ran with a magical turquoise clarity over a bed of smooth stones. They took off their shoes and waded into the icy stream, their laughter echoing in the glen. He showed her how to work his camera, how to frame the world, how to find the light. She was a natural, her poet's eye translating easily to the visual medium. She captured a shot of him, unawares, his face relaxed in a way she'd never seen before and felt a possessive thrill. Later, sitting on a sun-warmed rock, she pulled a pen and a paper napkin from her pocket. The words that had been locked away for so long came flooding back, not in a torrent, but in a slow, clear stream. She wrote a short, simple poem about light and water and the startling blue of a stranger's eyes. Without rereading it, she folded the napkin carefully and pressed it into his hand. "For your collection," she said softly. He tucked it into his shirt pocket over his heart without looking at it. The day felt stolen, a perfect incandescent bubble of time. They shared stories of their childhoods, hers in a bustling, sun-baked Naples apartment, his in the vast, empty plains of Nebraska. They created a history for themselves that consisted of only this single perfect day. As afternoon bled into evening, he drove them to Niced Point. They walked the long, steep path down to the lighthouse, a stark white tower standing sentinel at the very edge of the world. They sat on the grass, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and pink. It was breathtakingly beautiful and achingly finite. Then, as the last sliver of sun vanished, the lighthouse came to life. A brilliant white beam sliced through the deepening twilight, sweeping across the sea, over the cliffs, and across their faces in a slow, rhythmic pulse. Light, then dark. Light, then dark. The steady, predictable sweep of the beam was a reminder of the world outside their bubble. A world of order, of responsibility, of promises made long ago. It was Alessa who broke the spell. "I received a letter yesterday," she said, her voice quiet, almost lost in the sound of the waves below. "It was from Marco. He's coming at the end of the week, to take me home." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and irrefutable. Home. The word felt foreign, a place she no longer recognized. Elias didn't speak. He just watched the relentless rhythmic light. Light, then dark. "It always comes back around," he said, his voice flat. "A perfect circle. You can count on it." The unspoken meaning was painfully clear. The lighthouse beam was a circle, a constant. Their time together was a straight line, and they were standing at the end of it. The joyful abandon of the day dissolved, leaving behind a profound and tender sorrow. This beautiful, borrowed sun was setting, and they both knew it would not rise for them again. The choice was never discussed. It didn't need to be. It had been made for them years ago in other countries, in other lives. This day was a gift, a perfect memory to be stored away. It was not and could never be a beginning. The end came on a quiet, grey morning. The weather had returned to its sombre sky temperament, the sky a blanket of soft pearlescent grey, the air still and cool. The tide was out, exposing a wide expanse of dark, slick rocks and seaweed, the sea a distant, placid line. It felt like the island itself was holding its breath. Alessa was packed. Her 2 small suitcases stood by the door of her cottage, a silent testament to her imminent departure. Marco had arrived the night before, a whirlwind of cheerful, oblivious energy. He was a handsome man, with an easy smile and a proprietor's air of confidence. He had kissed Alessa soundly, declared the island air had worked miracles, and spoken at length about a dinner party they were hosting upon their return to Italy. He was the physical embodiment of the life she had chosen, the life to which she was returning. He saw her rosy cheeks and renewed energy, and saw only a successful cure. He did not see the ghost in her eyes. Now he was loading the car, humming a jaunty tune, blissfully unaware of the profound, silent drama unfolding just a few feet away. Elias stood on his porch. He and Alessa hadn't spoken since Marco's arrival. There was nothing left to say. Now, as Marco disappeared into the cottage for a final check, Elias walked across the damp grass that separated them. He stopped a few feet from her. The silence between them was vast, filled with the weight of their single, perfect day and the stormy, confessional night. There were no grand declarations, no pleas, no desperate promises. Theirs was a connection that had existed outside of language, and it would end the same way. It was a moment of profound, painful understanding. He held out his hand. In it was the photograph he had taken of her in the ruins. The black and white print was stark and beautiful. She looked strong, windswept, and alive. A woman she was only just beginning to know. "Something to remember the light," he said, his voice low and rough. Her hand trembled as she took it. She reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled out the small folded napkin. The ink of the poem was slightly smeared. "And you," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Something to remember the words." She pressed it into his hand. It was an exchange of the parts of themselves they had reawakened in each other. Her rediscovered strength, his broken silence. "Thank you," she said, the words a bare breath of sound, "for the quiet and for the storm." He gave a single sharp nod, his blue eyes holding hers for a long final moment. In their depths she saw the ruins, the storm, and the sun. She saw everything. Marco came back out, smiling. "All set, my love." He put a proprietary arm around her shoulder and guided her to the car. She did not look back. Elias stood motionless as they got in, as the engine started, as the car pulled away, its tyres crunching on the gravel drive. He didn't move until the car was a small speck disappearing down the winding road. Some stories you don't tell, he thought, his hand closing around the fragile paper in his pocket. You just live them, and that has to be enough. He slowly raised the camera that hung, as always, from his neck. He looked through the viewfinder, his vision blurring for a moment. He didn't aim it down the road where she had gone. He focused on the empty porch of her cottage, on the simple wooden chair where she had sat watching the fog. He focused on the empty space, a perfect composition of loss and memory. The shutter clicked, a final, quiet punctuation mark at the end of their story. For the rest of their lives, on opposite sides of the world, neither would ever hear the cry of a gull or feel the sea mist on their face without remembering the choice they made. Not for a lifetime, but for a moment that was, in its own way, enough. The Unbroken Chord. The air in the gaslight cafe was a thick, smoky soup, a concoction of stale cigarette ghosts, spilled beer, and the feverish, almost holy energy of youth on the brink of changing the world. It was late 1964, and Greenwich Village was the beating heart of that change. Eleonora Ellie Vance, however, felt like a ghost herself. She finished her final song, a crystalline ballad about a weeping willow she'd known in the gardens of her Connecticut home, and the applause that followed was polite, appreciative, but thin. It was the kind of applause you give a pretty porcelain doll on a shelf. You admire its craftsmanship, but you don't expect it to speak to your soul. Her voice, a thing of trained, bell-like purity, felt like a lie in her throat. She sang of pastoral beauty, while the newspapers screamed of fire hoses in Alabama and boys her age being shipped to a place called Vietnam. A chasm had opened between her art and her reality, and she was standing on the wrong side, singing melodies that felt as hollow as a drum. She retreated from the small, scarred wooden stage, her guitar case feeling heavier than it ever had before. Then he stepped into the light. He didn't so much walk to the stage as he claimed it, his presence a low hum of electricity in the crowded room. His name was Sam Jones, and everything about him was the antithesis of her. Where she was polished, he was raw. Where her guitar was pristine, his was a battered veteran, its body covered in the scuffs and scars of a life lived hard. He didn't speak a word, just settled onto the stool, his shoulders slumped, not in defeat, but with the weight of stories that needed telling. And then he played. It wasn't folk music, it was something older, deeper. It was the blues, dragged up from the Mississippi mud and steeped in the pain of generations. His voice, when it came, was the sound of gravel and whiskey, of smoke-filled juke joints and lonely roads. He sang of injustice, not in allegories or metaphors, but in stark, brutal poetry. He sang of a boy named Jimmy, a friend who wouldn't be coming home. The room, which had been a low babble of conversation, fell into a profound, reverent silence. Each note was a testament, each chord a piece of his soul laid bare. Ellie stood near the bar, frozen. He sings like he's lived 1,000 lives, she thought, a knot tightening in her chest, and every single one of them was harder than mine. What can I possibly offer a voice like that? His music wasn't just heard, it was felt. It was a physical force that rearranged the air, that made the comfortable uncomfortable and the complacent stir. When he finished, the silence held for a beat, a collective breath, before the room erupted in a roar of applause that was visceral, earned. Later, Sal, the club's owner, a shrewd man with a cigar permanently attached to his hand and an ear for what sold, cornered them both by the bar. "You," he said, jabbing the cigar toward Ellie, "you've got the voice of an angel, pure, clean, commercial." He then turned to Sam. "And you've got the fire, the grit. People are scared and they're angry. They want to hear that." He looked between them, a glint in his eye. "I want you to write together. Her polish, your guts, it's lightning in a bottle." Sam snorted, looking Ellie up and down. He saw the pressed collar of her blouse, the carefully coiffed blonde hair, the untouched innocence in her wide blue eyes. "I don't think she and I are singing the same language, Sal." "Then learn," Sal grunted before walking away. The air between them crackled. Ellie, stung by his dismissal but also drawn by the undeniable power of his performance, found her voice. "I thought your use of the dominant seventh was interesting. A little unrefined, but effective." Sam gave a humorless laugh, shaking his head as he leaned against the bar. He smelled of the road, of cigarettes and something else, something like wood smoke and earth. "Unrefined? Honey, where I come from, we don't have time to refine things. We're too busy trying to survive them." He looked at her, his dark eyes holding a challenge. "A pretty song about a willow tree won't stop a billy club, sweetheart. You have to be willing to get your hands dirty, to bleed on the page." His words were a punch, knocking the wind out of her carefully constructed world. He saw right through her, to the hollow place where her art should have been. The tension was immediate, a dissonant chord struck between two instruments that had no business being in the same orchestra. And yet, beneath the friction, something else resonated, a magnetic pull, a shared, unspoken understanding that the music they made alone was no longer enough. The world was changing, and they, whether they knew it or not, were about to change with it. The rain fell in steady grey sheets, washing the grime from the city streets and streaking the window panes of Ellie's small brownstone apartment. Inside, the world was one of quiet order. Books were stacked neatly, a metronome ticked with unshakable precision on her piano, and the air was clean, smelling faintly of lemon polish and old paper. It was a sanctuary of control, a world away from the chaotic energy of the gaslight. When Sam knocked, the sound was an intrusion. He stood on her doorstep dripping, his denim jacket soaked dark, his guitar case shedding water onto her welcome mat. He looked even more out of place here than he had at the club, a wild, untamed thing in her meticulously curated life. The awkwardness from their first meeting clung to him like the damp, a silent guest in the room. "Sorry about the floor," he mumbled, gesturing with his thumb at the small puddle forming at his feet. "It's just water," Ellie said, though her fingers twitched with the urge to wipe it up. They tried to work. They sat opposite each other, her at the piano, him on a delicate chair that seemed too small to hold him. It was a disaster. She'd offer a complex, soaring harmony, a cascade of notes learned through years of classical training, and he would just shake his head. "Too many words, too many chords," he'd say, his voice a low rumble. "You're hiding the truth." He'd counter with 3 simple, powerful chords on his guitar, chords that felt like a foundation, like bedrock. But he had no melody for them, only a rhythm, a pulse. Frustration mounted. The steady tick-tock of the metronome seemed to mock their lack of progress. They were speaking different languages, just as he'd predicted. She saw music as a thing of beauty and structure. He saw it as a tool, a weapon. Finally, Ellie stood up, walking to the window and watching the rain blur the world outside. The silence stretched, filled only by the metronome and the drumming of water. "My father says this music will only bring trouble," she said softly, her back to him. "That it's unladylike. But silence feels like a betrayal, doesn't it?" Sam didn't answer immediately. He just watched her, the rigid set of her shoulders, the way she clasped her hands behind her back. She keeps her anger locked up tight behind all those pretty notes, he thought. But I can hear it. It's the same quiet hum I've been carrying my whole life. When she turned back, her composure had cracked just enough. She was holding something in her hand. It was a newspaper clipping, the edges worn from handling. She unfolded it and laid it on the piano. The headline was stark, the black and white photograph beneath it grainy and horrifying. A peaceful protest in Selma being met with truncheons and dogs. "I can't stop looking at it," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "I read about it in my safe, warm apartment, and I write songs about trees." A single tear escaped, tracing a path down her cheek. It was the first truly honest thing she had shown him. Seeing that raw, unguarded emotion in her, something in Sam's own defences gave way. He looked at the clipping, a familiar ache tightening his chest. He reached into his own story, a place he rarely let anyone visit, and offered her a piece of it. "I left Mississippi because of a day like that," he said, his voice losing its hard edge. "My friend, the one I sang about, Jimmy. He just wanted to help people register to vote. He believed in the good of things. They found him by the side of the road 3 weeks later." He didn't say any more. He didn't have to. The shared grief, the shared outrage, finally bridged the gap between them. It was a sombre, sacred ground they could both stand on. Ellie sat back down at the piano. This time, when her fingers touched the keys, they didn't search for complexity. They found a simple, haunting melody that rose and fell like a lament, like the rain against the glass. It was full of the sorrow she'd been holding back. Sam picked up his guitar. He listened to her melody, and then he began to play. His 3 chords were no longer just a raw foundation. They were an anchor for her grief. He found the words, stark and real, drawn from the well of his own pain, but shaped by the new, shared understanding. They wrote about the cold cobblestones of a city street, about the sound of marching feet, about a cry for justice that was lost in the sirens. His gravelly voice intertwined with her clear, aching soprano. His raw power found its focus in her melodic grace. Against the backdrop of the rain, In the quiet of her orderly room, they created something new. It wasn't his song, and it wasn't hers. It was theirs. As the last note faded, they looked at each other over the neck of his guitar. The rain had stopped. The metronome had been forgotten. And in the quiet space between them, a new rhythm, fragile and hopeful, had begun. The recording studio was a lie, but it was a beautiful one. Tucked in the back of a dusty record shop on Bleecker Street, it was a small claustrophobic room where the walls were lined with grey, dented egg cartons, a futile but heartfelt attempt at soundproofing. Wires snaked across the floor like electric vines, and the air, thick with the smell of hot vacuum tubes and old dust, was electric with possibility. This was where music was born, where ghosts were captured on magnetic tape. Their first song, Cobblestone Cry, had been a whisper that was turning into a roar. It was being played on college radio stations from Berkeley to Boston, a bootleg recording of their first performance that had taken on a life of its own. Now, Sal had booked them 2 days in this makeshift studio to capture the lightning he'd seen and record a follow-up. They worked with a frantic, feverish energy, fueled by lukewarm coffee and a shared, driving sense of purpose. Sleep became an afterthought. The world shrank to the dimensions of this room, to the space between the notes. They worked in a proximity that was both professional and profoundly intimate. Sam would lean over Ellie's shoulder to point out a chord progression, his hand brushing her arm, sending a jolt through her that had nothing to do with the faulty wiring. She would reach across him to make a note on a lyric sheet, her hair falling across his cheek, the scent of her, clean and fresh like lavender, momentarily overwhelming the mustiness of the room. The small space became charged with an unspoken tension, a harmony that existed just beneath the music they were making. They were creating a song about holding on to hope in a world that seemed determined to extinguish it, and in the process they were becoming that hope for each other. On the second night, well past midnight, they were in the control booth, a closet-sized space dominated by a large hulking tape machine. They were listening to a playback of the final take. Murray, the engineer, a man who seemed to communicate only in grunts and head nods, had stepped out for a cigarette. The music filled the darkness. Ellie's voice, pure and soaring, was wrapped around Sam's, a lifeline of melody holding his raw, aching lyrics. The final chord hung in the air, a perfect resonant blend of their two souls, before fading into the soft hiss of the tape. Silence. It was a profound silence, heavy with the emotional weight of what they had just created together. It was their pain, their anger, their fragile hope, all woven into 3.5 minutes of sound. In the dim glow of the VU meters, Ellie could see the emotion etched on Sam's face. His usual guard was down, stripped away by exhaustion and the raw power of their own creation. He turned to look at her, his eyes dark and deep in the shadows. He didn't say anything. Words felt clumsy, inadequate for the moment. He reached out, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle as they cupped her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek. The touch was electric, a current that ran straight to her core. For the first time, she thought, her mind a dizzying swirl. The music wasn't just in the room, it was in me. His touch was the melody. My heartbeat was the drum. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. She couldn't. She leaned into him, closing her eyes as his lips met hers. The kiss was hesitant at first, a question. Then, as she responded, it deepened, becoming an answer, a confirmation of everything that had been building between them in the unspoken glances, the accidental touches, the shared silences. It tasted of stale coffee and cigarettes and something else, something that was just Sam, a deep, resonant certainty. It was a kiss that was both a release and a vow. It sealed the partnership they had forged in music and transformed it into something more. It was a promise made in the heart of their shared creation, A quiet chord struck in the darkness. When they finally broke apart, breathless, the hiss of the tape was the only sound. Sam rested his forehead against hers, his eyes still closed. "That," he whispered, his voice raspy with emotion, "that's the one note we've been missing." He was right. It was the crescendo they'd been building toward all along, a perfect, terrifying, beautiful note that would change the key of their lives forever. The spinning reel of tape in the corner seemed to capture it all. Not just the song, but the silence, the kiss, the vow. A moment of permanence in a world of static. The dressing room was a concrete box painted a sickly shade of green, located in the bowels of a large concert hall in Washington, D.C. A single, bare bulb hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows that seemed to amplify the tension. Through the walls, the sound of the crowd filtered in, not the intimate applause of a folk club, but the vast, restless roar of thousands of people gathered for a march. It sounded less like an audience and more like an ocean tide, powerful and unpredictable. The success of Cobblestone Cry and the buzz around their new song, The Unbroken Chord, had propelled them out of the village and onto a national stage. But fame, they were learning, was a double-edged sword. It brought them here to open for one of the biggest names in folk music, but it also brought scrutiny. Sal had called with a warning. A man in a cheap suit, probably FBI, had been asking questions around the clubs, asking about the troublemakers singing angry songs. And then there was the letter. It had arrived that morning, forwarded from her New York address. It was from her parents, the paper wrinkled and smelling faintly of her mother's rosewater perfume. The words were a torrent of love and fear, a desperate plea for her to come home, to leave this dangerous world of protest and radical music, to come back to the safety of the willow trees and manicured lawns. Ellie held it in her hand, the paper a tangible symbol of the world she'd left behind, a world that was trying to pull her back. Sam saw the letter. He saw the tremor in her hands, and the protective shell he had built around himself for years, the one she had so carefully started to dismantle, snapped back into place, harder and more fortified than ever. His past experiences, the ghosts of Mississippi, were no longer memories. They were present-day threats. He saw them in the shadows of the hallway, in the faceless roar of the crowd. "We're not singing it," he said, his voice flat. He was staring at the set list tacked to the mirror. His finger was pointing at the last song, The Unbroken Chord. It was their most powerful, most defiant, and most dangerous song. Ellie looked up, confused. "What are you talking about? It's our best song." "It's a target, Ellie," he shot back, his voice tight with a fear she'd never heard from him before. The lyrics, "Burn bright until the shadows flee." A single voice, 1,000 strong, can break the back of what is wrong. In this city, on this day, that's not a song, it's a provocation. They'll be watching us. "That's the point," she argued, standing up to face him. The small room felt even smaller, charged with their conflict. "The moment we let fear write our songs, we've already lost, Sam. Don't you see? This is the entire point. To be heard." "You've read about the cost, Ellie," he said, his voice rising, his hands clenched into fists. He took a step closer, his eyes burning with a desperate protective fire. "You read it in your newspaper clippings. I've paid it. I've seen what happens to people who provoke. I won't let you be the price for a song. I can't." His fear was a tangible thing, a raw living entity in the room. It wasn't for himself, she knew that. It was for her. It was a fear born of love, but it felt like a cage. The conflict was no longer about a set list or a lyric. It was about the fundamental chasm between their experiences. He had seen the darkness firsthand and wanted to shield her from it. She, having just found her voice, refused to be silenced. It was their first real fight, and it was tearing them apart, the static of the real world finally overwhelming their private melody. "So what do we do, Sam?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and hurt. "We go out there and sing about willow trees." The barb hit its mark. He recoiled as if struck. The love that had bloomed in the quiet intimacy of her apartment and the dark of the recording studio was now being tested under the harsh glare of reality. He loved her enough to want to silence her, and she loved him enough to refuse. The roar of the crowd outside swelled, a countdown to a choice that felt impossible. The glare of the spotlights was blinding, a wall of pure white heat that erased the thousands of faces in the crowd, turning them into a single breathing entity of shadow and sound. The tension from the dressing room followed them onto the stage, a third unwelcome presence. It was in the rigid set of Sam's shoulders, in the way Ellie's fingers felt slick on the neck of her guitar. They played their first two songs, their voices and instruments in perfect practiced harmony, but their eyes carefully avoided each other. The performance was flawless, professional, and completely hollow. The connection that had made their music transcendent was gone, replaced by a painful, echoing silence. Then came the final slot in their set, the moment of truth. Sam looked at Ellie, his expression a storm of conflict. He wanted to protect her. He wanted to honour their truth. The two desires were at war within him. He gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head, a final silent plea. Then he turned to the microphone and started the simple, unassuming intro to Cobblestone Cry. It was the safe choice, the song that had made them, but the one that wouldn't break them. Ellie watched him, her heart aching. She could follow his lead, sing the familiar words, and let their defiance die here, on this stage, a casualty of fear. She could choose safety, or she could choose the woman Sam had helped her become. She met his gaze across the stage, pouring every ounce of trust, of love, of conviction she possessed into that single look. Then she took a breath. Ignoring his melody, she leaned into her microphone, and with a voice that was clear and steady despite the tremor in her soul, she began to sing. A single match in a darkened room. It was the opening line of the Unbroken Chord, the forbidden song, the song of truth. A wave of shock rippled through the audience who'd been expecting their hit. Sam's fingers faltered on his guitar strings, the chord dying with a discordant buzz. He stared at her, his eyes wide. This was it, the choice, laid bare for thousands to see. He looked out at the vast sea of faces, people holding signs, people hungry for a voice. He saw their hope, their anger, their fear. It was the same hope and fear that lived inside him. He looked back at Ellie. She was still singing, her eyes locked on his, trusting him to catch her. She was not the porcelain doll he had met months ago. She was fire and steel. She was brave. A slow smile touched the corner of his lips, a look of pure, unadulterated pride. He closed his eyes for a single beat, and then he changed chords. His fingers found the powerful driving progression of their anthem. He joined her, his voice meshing with hers, not in defeat, but in triumphant surrender. Their harmony, reborn in this act of mutual defiance, was more powerful than it had ever been. It soared over the crowd, a declaration not just of political conviction, but of their faith in each other. It was a musical vow renewed under the glare of the spotlights. The performance was transcendent, a moment where love and purpose became one and the same. The roar that followed was not just applause, it was a chorus of solidarity. Much later, as the first hint of dawn painted the Washington sky in shades of bruised purple and soft grey, they stood by the Lincoln Memorial reflecting pool. The city was quiet now. The energy of the march faded into an exhausted, hopeful peace. The water was a perfect still mirror, reflecting the monument and the vast, quiet sky. They were bone-weary, but the tension between them had dissolved, replaced by a profound, unshakable calm. Sam reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. "My whole life," he said, his voice soft in the pre-dawn stillness. "I've only ever sung about what was lost. With you, I'm finally singing about what's worth fighting for." Ellie leaned her head on his shoulder, the rough denim of his jacket a familiar comfort. We didn't know what tomorrow would bring, another hit song or a government file, but his hand was in mine, and for the first time the future felt less like a threat and more like a song we had yet to write. He didn't promise her it would be easy. He didn't promise her safety. He promised her something better. He promised they would face the static together, a two-part harmony against the noise. In an age of noise and fury, their love was not a quiet shelter from the storm, but the most defiant song of all. The orchard keeper's promise. The final turn of the lane was a memory etched so deep in Charlotte Vale's soul that her hands tightened on the worn leather of her reticule before her eyes even registered the view. It had been 10 years since she had fled this corner of the Sussex countryside, a blushing bride on the arm of a man who had promised her the world and had, in the end, left her with nothing but his name and a silence that echoed louder than any cannon. Now, in the late spring of 1847, she was simply Mrs. Vale, a widow at 28, returning not in triumph, but in retreat. The carriage wheels slowed, their rhythmic crunch on the gravel path a sound that vibrated up through the floorboards and into her bones. Outside the window, the world was a riot of untamed green. Hawthorn hedges, thick and thorny, spilled onto the lane, their white blossoms like fistfuls of scattered pearls. The air that drifted through the open window was thick, sweet, and damp, carrying the scent of wet earth, burgeoning life, and something else. The faint, ghosting perfume of apple blossoms. Her heart gave a painful thud. Home, or what was left of it. After the driver had unloaded her modest trunks, leaving them like sentinels by the sagging gate, the carriage rattled away, its departure sealing her in a profound quiet. She was alone. Before her stood her late uncle's legacy, a 2-story stone cottage, its windows dark and watchful, and beyond it, the orchard. She walked towards the trees, the hem of her grey morning dress whispering against the tall, wet grass. The air here, it remembered her, even if she had tried so hard to forget. Every rustle of the leaves felt like a whisper of the girl I once was. The orchard was a wreck, a beautiful, tragic wreck. Branches, heavy with leaf but sparse with blossom, clawed at each other, a tangled knot of woody limbs reaching for a sun they could barely find. Weeds choked the ground, and the air of neglect was as palpable as the dampness clinging to the bark. It felt like a mirror to her own heart, a place of once vibrant potential, now overgrown with the thorns of grief. Her fingers, pale and trembling slightly, reached out to touch the gnarled trunk of a familiar giant, its bark a topography of shared history. This was the one, the old sentinel at the edge of the grove. It was beneath this very tree that Gabriel Hughes had stolen her first kiss, a clumsy, breathless collision of lips that had tasted of sunshine and unripe apples. The memory was so vivid it made her ache, a phantom limb of a life she'd never lived. "It has missed a woman's touch." The voice came from behind her, deep and steady as the earth itself. It was a voice she hadn't heard in a decade, yet knew as well as her own name. She turned slowly, her heart a frantic bird in her ribs. It was him, Gabriel Hughes. The boy was gone, replaced by a man forged from labour and time. His shoulders were broader, his jaw stronger, set with a sternness she didn't recognise. His hair, the colour of dark honey, was ruffled by the breeze, and his eyes, those startlingly clear grey-blue eyes, held a reserved, unreadable expression. His hands, resting at his sides, were calloused and stained with soil, the hands of a man who spoke the language of the land. He held no hat, a sign of respect that felt both practiced and strangely intimate. "Gabriel," she breathed, the name a soft puff of air. "Mrs. Vale," he corrected gently, his gaze unwavering. The formality was a chasm between them, wider and deeper than the 10 years that had passed. The air crackled, thick with unspoken questions and the ghosts of 2 teenagers who had once carved their initials into a tree not 20 feet from where they now stood. I've come to see to my uncle's affairs," she said, her voice sounding thin and reedy to her own ears. He nodded, a short, sharp dip of his chin. "I heard. A good man, your uncle. He loved this place." His eyes swept over the tangled branches, a flicker of something, sadness perhaps, or frustration, crossing his features. "The old place needs a firm hand, Miss Vale." He caught himself, a faint flush creeping up his neck. "Charlotte, the trees have been waiting." The use of her given name, even as a correction, was a spark in the heavy air. It was a slip, a glimpse of the boy beneath the stoic farmer. He offered no apology, simply stood there, a solid presence against the backdrop of decay. "I wouldn't know where to begin," she confessed, a wave of despair washing over her. The task felt monumental, impossible. He considered her for a long moment, his gaze taking in her sensible but impractical dress, her pale city hands, the weary slump of her shoulders. He seemed to see not just the woman she was, but the girl she had been, and the gulf that lay between the two. "I can help," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, a gesture that felt less like a neighbourly kindness, and more like a duty he was compelled to fulfill. "If you'll have me, for your uncle's sake, for your uncle's sake." The words were a careful boundary, a line drawn in the dirt between them. She knew she should refuse, that his presence here would only stir memories best left buried, but looking at the wild, broken orchard, feeling the profound weight of her own solitude, she knew she couldn't. She needed help. She needed him. "Thank you, Gabriel," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I would be most grateful." He gave another short nod. The matter settled. And as he turned to point out a branch afflicted with canker, explaining the remedy in his low, steady voice, Charlotte felt a fragile tendril of hope unfurl within her. It was a terrifying, exhilarating feeling. The orchard was in ruin, and so was she. But perhaps, just perhaps, together they could learn to grow again. The days that followed fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the trees. It began with the sound of Gabriel's steady footfalls on the path just after dawn, and it ended with the long shadows of evening striping the orchard floor. Their silence at first was as thick as the overgrown underbrush they cleared. It was a silence of history, of things left unsaid, of a path cruelly diverged. But the work became their bridge. They didn't speak of London or her late husband, or the years he'd spent toiling on his family's neighbouring farm. Instead, they spoke of the earth. Gabriel taught her the arcane language of the orchard, the difference between a water sprout and a fruit-bearing spur, the telltale signs of root rot, the delicate art of grafting new life onto old stock. His voice, once so guarded, would soften when he spoke of the trees, a quiet passion burning through his reserve. Charlotte, in turn, proved a dedicated student. She found a strange solace in the physical ache of the labour. Pruning the dead wood felt like clearing the cobwebs from her own soul. Her hands, once soft and pale, became scratched and calloused, and she wore the dirt beneath her fingernails like a badge of honour. She was no longer just a widow in mourning. She was a woman at work, fighting for something to live. One sweltering afternoon, she was wrestling with a particularly stubborn branch on a gnarled pippin tree. It was dead wood, thick as her wrist, and refused to yield to her saw. Frustration pricked at her, sharp and hot. "You're fighting it," Gabriel's voice said, close behind her. She hadn't heard him approach. Let the saw do the work. He stepped forward, his body close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. He reached around her, his large soil-stained hands covering hers on the handle of the saw. The contact was a bolt of lightning on a clear day, a jolt of pure, unadulterated awareness that shot up her arms and settled, warm and fluttering in her chest. His skin was rough against hers, his presence solid and overwhelmingly male. For a breathless moment, neither of them moved. The world seemed to shrink to that single point of contact, the sounds of the orchard, the buzzing bees, the rustling leaves, fading to a distant hum. He guided her hands, his voice a low murmur against her ear. Slow, steady strokes. Find its rhythm. Together they moved the saw back and forth, and the dead branch finally gave way with a satisfying crack, thudding to the ground below. They sprang apart as if scalded, the space between them suddenly charged with a tension that had nothing to do with stubborn branches. Gabriel cleared his throat, turning his attention to the fallen limb with an intensity that was wholly feigned. Charlotte's heart hammered against her ribs, a wild and unfamiliar beat. Later they took their midday meal of bread, hard cheese and cool water from the well. Without discussion, they settled in the shade of the old sentinel tree at the edge of the grove, their kissing tree. The memory of that day hung between them, as tangible as the dappled sunlight filtering through the leaves. It was a shared secret, a silent testament to a story that had never been finished. Charlotte risked a glance at him. He was staring out across the rows of trees, his expression thoughtful. "My uncle always said you could hear the secrets of the orchard if you listened long enough," she said softly, breaking the silence. "I think I'm only just beginning to learn its language." Gabriel turned to her, his gaze holding hers. A flicker of a smile touched his lips, a rare and precious thing. He was right. These trees, they remember everything. Who planted them? Who cared for them? Who neglected them? He picked up a fallen apple blossom, its petals already browning at the edges, and rolled it between his thumb and forefinger. They remember the girl who used to climb their branches without a care in the world. He looked at her then, and for a moment the stoic farmer vanished, and she saw the boy he'd been, the boy who had looked at her with such open, unguarded adoration. He saw it too, the reflection of his own memory in her eyes. He looked away quickly, his jaw tightening as the mask of impassivity slid back into place. She still looks at the world with that same wonder, he thought, a familiar ache twisting in his gut. I had thought the years would have taken it. I had thought I had taken it. He stood, dusting the crumbs from his trousers. "The sun is moving," he said, his tone once again brisk and practical. "There's a section of Bramley's that needs attention before evening." As he walked away, Charlotte remained seated, her fingers tracing the rough bark of the tree. The warmth of his hand on hers still tingled on her skin. The work was mending the orchard, yes, but it was also tending to roots she thought had been severed long ago, uncovering a connection that had lain dormant, waiting beneath the surface of the years. Summer settled over the Sussex countryside, heavy and ripe. The days grew longer, the work in the orchard more intense, and the space between Charlotte and Gabriel smaller. The physical boundaries they had so carefully maintained began to blur. A shared look over a row of trees, a hand offered to help her over a tangle of roots, the easy companionship of their shared lunches. Each was a small thread, weaving them closer together. The breaking point came, as it so often does with a storm. It rolled in from the west one afternoon, a bruised purple mass of clouds that swallowed the sun and turned the vibrant greens of the orchard to a sombre, brooding grey. The first drops of rain were fat and lazy, splattering against the dusty leaves. Then, the heavens opened. A torrential downpour descended, turning the orchard paths to rivulets of mud and plastering their clothes to their skin in seconds. "The cottage!" Gabriel yelled over the roar of the rain, grabbing her hand. His grip was firm, urgent, and she didn't hesitate. They ran, laughing breathlessly like children, splashing through puddles until they tumbled onto the stone porch of the keeper's cottage, dripping and gasping for air. Inside, the small space was dim and smelled of old paper, wood smoke, and damp stone. The rhythmic drumming of rain on the slate roof was a constant hypnotic beat, enclosing them in a world of their own. The storm showed no signs of abating. They were trapped. To combat the chill, Gabriel built a fire in the hearth, his movements efficient and sure. The flames caught, casting a warm, flickering glow across the room, painting his strong features in shades of orange and gold. While he worked, Charlotte, seeking to busy her hands, turned to a dusty wooden chest in the corner, her uncle's old records. She sat on the floor by the fire, the chest open before her, and began sorting through the contents. Ledgers filled with her uncle's spidery script, receipts for feed and tools, and a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. Curiosity piqued, she untied them. They were drafts of letters from her uncle to her father, written nearly 9 years ago. Her brow furrowed as she read the worried, pleading words. "I must implore you to reconsider," her uncle had written. "The Hughes family are good people, honest farmers. To call in this debt now, after such a poor harvest, would be their ruin. It is a debt of honour, I understand, but surely compassion must temper justice." A cold dread trickled down Charlotte's spine. She read on, her uncle's words painting a picture of desperation. He wrote of Gabriel's father, a proud man forced into a terrible position. He wrote of Gabriel himself, a young man of 18 with a bright future, forced to abandon any plans for his own farm to work his family's land to the bone, just to keep their heads above water. She looked up, the letters trembling in her hand. Gabriel was watching her, his face a stony mask, but his eyes were dark with a storm of their own. He had seen the letters. He knew what she was reading. "The summer before I left," she whispered, the pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. "You stopped coming to the fence. You stopped looking at me." Gabriel's jaw worked, the muscle clenching and unclenching. He stared into the fire, his voice low and rough when he finally spoke. "Your father came to see mine. He was polite, a gentleman. He simply stated that the loan, made in good faith years before, was now due. In full. We had nothing. The blight had taken nearly half the crop." The air in the small cottage grew thick, heavy with the weight of this long-buried secret. This was the ghost that had haunted them, the true reason for the silence, the distance. It wasn't just that she had left, it was that he had been forced to let her go. "He said," Gabriel continued, his voice raw, "that it would be unwise for the son of a debtor to be seen courting the daughter of a man of property. He made it clear my place was here, far below yours." Tears pricked Charlotte's eyes, hot and shameful. "Oh, Gabriel, I never knew." All these years she had carried her own narrative of their ending, a story of youthful fancy and circumstance. She had never imagined the brutal, calculated cruelty of it. "All these years," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "I thought I was the only one with a ghost at my shoulder. You carried one too." The sight of her tears seemed to break something in him. The rigid control he held over himself finally fractured. He turned from the fire, his eyes shining with an agony he had suppressed for a decade. "Some debts aren't settled with coin," he said, his voice cracking. "They're paid in silence." In distance, he took a ragged breath. "Do you think I wanted to let you go? I saw you in that carriage, Charlotte, riding away to a new life, and I stood here, tethered to this land by your father's chains, and I swore I would never let myself feel that way again. I would never hope for something so far out of my reach. He confessed it all then, that he had never stopped thinking of her, that his stoicism was a shield, his silence a penance. He had built a fortress around his heart to keep from breaking it a second time, and in the warm, firelit intimacy of the cottage, with the storm raging outside, Charlotte rose to her feet and closed the distance between them. She didn't offer platitudes or apologies for her father's sins. Instead, she reached out and laid a hand gently on his arm, a silent offering of shared sorrow. He looked down at her hand, then up at her face, and in his eyes she saw the walls of his fortress finally begin to crumble. The rain fell, washing the world clean, and inside the small stone cottage 2 hearts began, tentatively, to heal. Just as a fragile sense of hope had begun to take root in the orchard, the blight arrived. It came not as a sudden storm, but as a creeping pestilence, a sinister whisper on the early autumn air. It started on the lower branches of the copse's orange pippins, presenting as ugly brown spots on the leaves, which soon curled and withered as if touched by frost. Within a week it had spread. The apples themselves, which had been swelling with the promise of a bountiful harvest, began to show the same telltale blemishes, a sickness spreading just beneath the skin. Desperation coiled in Charlotte's stomach, cold and sharp. The orchard was more than just land and trees. It was her solvency, her purpose, her one tangible link to a future she was trying to build. To lose it now, after they had poured so much of themselves into its revival, felt like a uniquely cruel twist of fate. The village, which had been watching her progress with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion, began to whisper. Old resentments against her proud London family surfaced like weeds. "It's a cursed plot," she overheard one woman mutter at the market. "Pride comes before the fall, they say." The words stung, isolating her further, but she was not alone. The crisis which could have driven them apart instead forged Gabriel and Charlotte into a singular, determined force. The blight was not a ghost of the past they had to navigate. It was a physical enemy, a tangible threat they could fight together. All his reserve vanished, replaced by a fierce, protective energy. "We won't lose it," he stated, his jaw set, his eyes blazing with a fire she'd never seen. "Not this. I won't let you lose anything else." His knowledge of the land became their greatest weapon. He showed her old remedies passed down through his family, a pungent spray made from copper and lime, the importance of burning the afflicted leaves to halt the spread. Their days became a frantic race against the creeping decay. They worked from sunrise until the last light failed, their hands and clothes perpetually stained, their bodies aching with a weariness that went bone deep. The true test came during a week of damp, chilling weather that the blight seemed to thrive on. Gabriel announced they would have to light smudge pots, small, smoky fires, throughout the night to raise the temperature around the trees and ward off the damp. That night was a descent into a smoky, surreal hell. The air grew thick and acrid, burning their throats and making their eyes water. The orchard, which had been a place of burgeoning life, was transformed into a hazy, fire-lit battlefield. They moved like wraiths through the smoke, their faces smudged with soot, their movements economical and synchronized, born of shared purpose. They didn't need to speak. A look, a nod, a shared glance was enough. In the deepest hour of the night, with the moon a hazy smudge behind the smoke, they paused for a moment near the centre of the grove, leaning against each other in their shared exhaustion. The world was silent save for the crackle of the small fires and their own ragged breathing. In the flickering, uncertain light, Charlotte looked at Gabriel. The soot on his face couldn't hide the deep lines of fatigue around his eyes, or the fierce determination in his gaze. All the barriers between them, the years, the secrets, the class divide, had been burned away, leaving only this raw, profound connection. In the face of ruin, I felt no fear, she thought, a sense of wonder cutting through her exhaustion. There, with his hand in mine, amidst the smoke and the dying leaves, I had never felt more alive. Almost unconsciously she reached out, her fingers gently brushing a smudge of soot from his cheek. It was an act of simple, unguarded tenderness. He stilled, his breath catching. Then he captured her hand, not pulling away, but pressing her palm flat against his cheek, holding it there. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch like a man starved for comfort. The gesture was his surrender. It was his choice. In that smoky, desperate night, he was no longer the boy forced to stand aside, but the man choosing to stand with her, to fight for her. He opened his eyes, and the look he gave her held all the words he'd never been able to say. He would not let her fall. They would face this, and whatever came next, together. The air was thick with smoke, but for the first time they could both see their future clearly. The battle against the blight was not a decisive victory, but a hard-won truce. They lost a portion of the crop, but they saved more than they lost. The apples they harvested were smaller, some slightly blemished, but they were theirs, wrested from the brink by sheer will and shared labour. Charlotte, with Gabriel's help, spent weeks pressing cider and baking pies, her small cottage kitchen filled with the warm, spicy scent of cinnamon and cooking apples. When the night of the annual village harvest festival arrived, the air was crisp and clear, smelling of wood smoke and frost. The village green was a galaxy of bobbing lanterns, casting a warm, celebratory glow on the faces of the community. In the centre of it all, on a long trestle table, sat Charlotte's offerings, golden-crusted pies and jugs of dark amber cider. When people tasted them, their expressions of surprise, then delight, were a balm to her weary soul. She had not just saved a harvest, she had earned a place. Then the fiddler struck up a lively country dance. The music was a joyful, foot-stomping tune that seemed to pull everyone into its orbit. Charlotte watched from the sidelines, a small smile on her face, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She felt a presence beside her and turned to see Gabriel. He looked different tonight, washed clean of soot and soil, wearing a simple but clean shirt. He had always held himself apart at these village functions, a quiet observer on the periphery. But tonight, his eyes were fixed on her. Without a word, he held out his hand. It was no longer the hesitant, careful hand of their early days. It was a firm, confident, open invitation. Her heart leaped. Taking his hand was more than just accepting a dance. It was a public declaration. She placed her hand in his, and his fingers closed around hers, warm and sure. He led her into the swirling throng of dancers. They moved together with an effortless grace, as if they had been dancing together their whole lives. He swung her out, and she laughed, a genuine, full-throated laugh that felt like a release. As he drew her back in, his arms securely around her waist, their eyes met over the heads of the other dancers. In the warm lantern light, they were the only two people in the world. The whispers of the village gossips faded away, replaced by the triumphant music of the fiddle. Later, when the dancing had slowed and the moon was high in the sky, he took her hand again. "Come with me," he said, his voice a low murmur meant only for her. He led her away from the fading lights of the festival, down the familiar lane and back through the gate of the orchard. Their orchard. The trees stood as dark, sleeping silhouettes against the star-dusted sky, their branches bare, resting after their long fight. The air was still and cold, but full of the quiet promise of spring. He led her to the heart of the grove, stopping beneath the ancient gnarled branches of the kissing tree. It stood as a silent witness to their entire story, to the boy and girl who had been, and the man and woman they had become. He turned to face her, his hands finding hers in the darkness, He didn't have a grand, poetic speech. His words were as simple and true as the earth beneath their feet. "Charlotte," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "When I was a boy, I dreamed of a life I thought I could never have. A life with you. Then I spent 10 years trying to forget that dream." He squeezed her hands gently. "Working here, with you, it brought that dream back to life. I don't have much to offer, just calloused hands and a heart that's been yours since the first blossom. Let's build a life here. Let's plant new roots, see new seasons, together." Tears streamed freely down her face, tears of joy, of relief, of a happiness so profound it ached. "Yes," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, Gabriel. Yes." He released one of her hands to gently cup her face, his thumb stroking away a tear, and then he kissed her. It was not the clumsy, breathless kiss of their youth, nor the desperate, smoke-filled moment of their crisis. This kiss was deep and sure, a kiss that held the memory of the first and the promise of 1,000 more. It was a kiss that tasted of autumn air and sweet cider and finally of home. And in the quiet heart of the orchard, under a blanket of stars, she realized a promise made by a boy had finally been kept by a man. A promise not of a life without winter, but of a love strong enough to tend the roots and wait always for the spring. Sunday Morning Eyes. The first light of Sunday in Albuquerque is a shy thing. It washes the sandier mountains in a soft apologetic pink before spilling into the city, finding its way through the arched stained glass windows of St. Jude's Church. For Naomi Carter, this was the hour of stillness, a sacred buffer between the quiet of her own life and the clamour of the world's needs. The soup kitchen, housed in the church's expansive basement, smelled of bleach, industrial-strength coffee, and the ghosts of 1,000 meals served. It was a scent she knew better than any perfume. Her movements were a meditation, the rhythmic wipe of a damp cloth across stainless steel counters, the solid, satisfying thunk of canned goods being placed on shelves. Each precise action was a brick in the wall she'd built around her heart, a fortress of routine to keep the chaos at bay. It had been 2 years since Mark, 2 years since her belief in the inherent goodness of people had been auctioned off for a lie. He had volunteered here too, with a smile as bright and empty as a movie set. He had praised her faith, her generosity, her open heart, all while drafting the blueprints to ruin her with it. Another one, she thought, her hands pausing over a stack of clean bowls. He has that same look they all have at first, eager to fix something. But what happens when they realise the brokenness is in them too? The heavy door at the top of the stairs creaked open, and a different kind of quiet entered the room. He was a big man, broad in the shoulders, with a solidness that seemed to suck the air toward him. But he moved with a deliberate, almost silent grace that was entirely at odds with his frame. He wore a faded flannel shirt and jeans, and his hair was cropped close to his scalp. His eyes, a deep, steady hazel, scanned the room once, taking everything in before they landed on her. There was no grandstanding, no announcement. He just stood there, waiting. "You must be Micah," Naomi said, her voice sounding louder than she intended in the cavernous space. Pastor John had told her an ex-Marine was coming, looking for a way to serve. He gave a short single nod. "Micah Bellamy?" His voice was low, a gravel road at dusk. "I'm Naomi Carter. I run the kitchen." She gestured vaguely around the room. "Welcome." He walked down the stairs, his boots making soft, solid sounds on the linoleum. "Just tell me where you need me," he said, his gaze direct, unwavering. "I'm good at following orders." There was no pretense in his words, no false humility. It was a simple statement of fact. Naomi felt a flicker of something. Not suspicion, exactly, but a deep-seated weariness. She'd heard it all before. She led him to a long prep table where 3 industrial-sized bags of sliced bread sat waiting. "We can start you on the toast," she said, pointing to a tub of softened butter and a small spatula. "We go through hundreds of slices, just a thin layer on each one. They'll go on the griddle in an hour." She expected him to balk, or at least show a flash of disappointment at the menial task. Mark would have charmed his way into a more important job within minutes, but Micah simply nodded again, pulled up a stool and began to work. Naomi moved to the other side of the kitchen to start dicing onions, the sting in her eyes a familiar companion. From her station she could watch him. His hands, which looked like they could tear a phone book in half, were surprisingly gentle. There was no wasted motion. He'd pick up a slice, swipe the butter on with a clean, efficient stroke, and lay it on a baking sheet, creating neat, overlapping rows. Thump scrape, thump scrape. The rhythm was steady, meditative. It was the sound of work without ego. An hour later, the other volunteers began to trickle in, filling the space with chatter and the clatter of pans. Maria, a woman whose heart was as big as her capacity for gossip, bustled over to Naomi. "Did you see the new one?" she whispered, nodding toward Micah, who was still at his post. The mountain of bread, now a neatly buttered field. "He's so quiet. Not like that last one you had in here. What was his name?" Mark Maria clicked her tongue. "All flash, that one. I heard he's heading up that big new downtown development, the one right by the river." Naomi's hands tightened around the knife. She could feel Micah's rhythm falter for a single beat before resuming. Thump scrape. He had heard. Of course, he had. She felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck. Her failure, her naivety, served up as idle Sunday morning gossip. She forced a tight smile for Maria. "Yes, I heard that," she said, her voice clipped. She didn't look at Micah, but she could feel his presence across the room. It wasn't a stare of pity or judgment. It was just a presence, a quiet, solid weight in the room. When she finally risked a glance, he wasn't looking at her. His focus was entirely on the task in front of him, his expression unreadable. But as he reached for another slice of bread, she saw his gaze soften for just a fraction of a second. A flicker of understanding that asked for nothing in return. It was a look that didn't try to fix anything. It simply acknowledged the break. And in the noisy, bustling sanctuary of the soup kitchen, that small, silent gesture was the most profound thing she'd felt in years. The weeks that followed settled into a new kind of rhythm. Micah Bellamy became as much a fixture of Sunday mornings as the smell of coffee and the low murmur of prayer from the chapel upstairs. He never spoke of what he'd overheard, and Naomi never offered an explanation. Their relationship was built in the silent spaces, in the language of small, consistent actions. He always arrived 15 minutes early. By the time Naomi came downstairs, the industrial coffee urns would be filled and gurgling, their rich, dark aroma a welcome she'd come to anticipate. He learned the routines without being told. He knew which shelves held the extra sugar, where the mops were kept, and how to organise the pantry with a Tetris-like precision that soothed a part of Naomi's soul she didn't know was frayed. He never pushed for conversation, but he was a powerful listener. When Maria fretted about her husband's health, or when a young man named Carlos spoke of his struggle to find work, Micah would pause his task, be it scrubbing pots or hauling trash, and give them his full, undivided attention. He didn't offer advice. He offered respect. Naomi watched it all from her carefully constructed distance, her curiosity warring with her caution. She had built her life on the principle of faith, but trust was a different currency, one she had spent down to nothing. Yet she found herself cataloguing the small proofs of his character. The way he'd discreetly slip an extra bread roll to an elderly man he knew had a long walk home. the way he addressed everyone, from the pastor to the most dishevelled guest, with the same quiet courtesy. These weren't grand gestures designed to impress. They were footnotes in the story of a man, visible only to those who were paying attention. And Naomi, despite herself, was paying attention. One Sunday, about a month after he'd started, a new mother came in, her face pale with exhaustion and streaked with tears. She was young, barely out of her teens, and clutched a baby wrapped in a thin, worn blanket. I don't have anything, she whispered to Naomi, her voice cracking. I ran out of diapers last night. Naomi's heart clenched. She led the young woman to a chair and went to the supply closet. Her stomach dropped when she saw the empty shelf where the emergency diaper stash should have been. A shipment was late. A wave of helpless frustration washed over her. She turned back, ready to apologize, to offer what little she could, but the kitchen door was already swinging shut. Micah was gone. For a brief, ugly moment, Naomi's cynicism flared. Had the raw, unfiltered need in the room been too much for him? But 10 minutes later the door opened again. Micah walked in, his face impassive, and placed 2 large packs of diapers and 3 cans of formula on the counter beside the young mother. He didn't say a word to her or to Naomi. He simply met Naomi's wide, questioning eyes with a steady gaze, gave a nearly imperceptible nod, and walked back to the dishwashing station, the sound of him rinsing plates a steady rhythm against the mother's quiet, grateful sobs. Later that afternoon, as the last of the volunteers left, a sudden desert thunderstorm broke, the sky turning a bruised purple grey. Rain lashed against the windows. Naomi was wiping down the final counter when she saw him through the glass, pulling a thick waterproof cover over his motorcycle. An image of him on the slick asphalt, exposed to the violent rain, flashed in her mind. It was an impulse, a feeling of debt she couldn't ignore. She grabbed her keys and pushed through the heavy door. "Micah!" she called out over the roar of the wind. He turned, rain plastering his short hair to his head. "Don't be ridiculous, you can't ride in this. Let me give you a ride." He seemed about to refuse, but she was already unlocking the doors to her small 10-year-old sedan. He hesitated for another moment before folding his large frame into the passenger seat. The car, which had always felt spacious enough, suddenly seemed tiny, charged with his presence. The windows fogged instantly. The world outside disappeared into a blur of wind and water, leaving them in an intimate, isolated world for 2. The only sounds were the frantic drumming of rain on the roof and the rhythmic slap of the windshield wipers. The silence wasn't awkward. It was full. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice soft. "For the diapers. You didn't have to do that." He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the deluge outside. "Some things you just do," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "It's not for thanks. It's for balance." He turned to look at her then, and in the dim, watery light of the car she saw the exhaustion etched around his eyes. "Back there," he said, nodding toward the unseen world of sand and conflict he'd left behind. "Everything is loud. The explosions, the orders, the quiet when it's over. It's a different kind of loud. It gets in your head, stays there." He paused, searching for the words. "This," he said, gesturing back toward the church. "The work. It quiets the noise." It was the most he had ever said to her about himself. It wasn't a story of combat or heroism. It was a confession of a wound, an explanation for his search for peace. And in the close, quiet space of her car, surrounded by the storm, Naomi felt the first tentative crack appear in the wall around her heart. She wasn't just looking at a volunteer anymore. She was seeing a man who was trying, in his own silent way, to find his way back home. A few weeks later, Pastor John, with a cheerful obliviousness to the delicate, unspoken thing growing between them, tasked Naomi and Micah with a new project, clearing out the old storage room at the back of the church hall. The space hadn't been touched in decades. It was a tomb of forgotten histories smelling of dust, decaying paper, and time itself. The air was thick and still, and the only light came from a single grime-covered window high on one wall, which cast a dramatic shaft of dusty gold across the room. The space was tight, forcing a new kind of proximity. They worked in a shared, careful silence, their shoulders brushing as they navigated around precarious stacks of hymnals and boxes of old holiday decorations. Naomi found herself acutely aware of him, the quiet sound of his breathing, the way his flannel shirt stretched across his back when he lifted a heavy box of old vestments. There was an intimacy to the shared task, a sense of unearthing more than just forgotten objects. It was Naomi who found the box of old vinyl records, tucked away beneath a pile of moth-eaten choir robes. "Oh, wow," she breathed, pulling it out into the light. The cardboard was soft with age. She sifted through the albums, the covers telling a story of the church's past, Handel's Messiah, gospel choirs, and then a surprise. A worn copy of Etta James's At Last. Micah, who had been wrestling with a tangled pile of microphone cables, paused. He came over and gently took the record from her. He ran a thumb over Etta's face, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "My mother loved this one," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "She had a voice like honey and whiskey. Every Sunday morning before church she'd put this on while she made pancakes. She'd sing along, snapping her fingers." He looked up from the record, but his eyes were somewhere far away, lost in a sun-drenched memory. "She'd say Etta didn't just sing a song. She told you the truth about your own heart, whether you were ready to hear it or not." For the first time, Naomi saw past the quiet ex-marine and the diligent volunteer. She saw a son. She saw the deep, hidden well of gentleness in him, a tenderness he kept guarded behind his stoic silence. The sight of it, so unexpected and so profound, made her own carefully constructed walls feel brittle and thin. His vulnerability was an invitation. Before she could stop herself, the words were spilling out, quiet and shaky in the dusty air. "My ex-fiancé," she started, her voice barely a whisper. "Mark, he told me my kindness was a weakness. He said I saw the good in everyone and that it wasn't a virtue, it was a flaw, a liability he could leverage." The shameful confession hung between them, raw and real. "He made me feel like my faith was just another word for gullible. How do you trust again when your own heart feels like a liability?" Micah didn't move. He just stood there, holding the record, his gaze steady and intense as it returned from the past and focused entirely on her. He didn't offer empty platitudes or easy reassurances. He didn't say he was wrong. Instead, he looked around the cluttered room, his eyes landing on a box of donated items from an old parishioner's estate. He reached inside and pulled out a small porcelain dove, its surface coated in a fine layer of dust. One of its wings had a small hairline chip near the tip. He stepped closer, the shaft of light illuminating the space between them. He gently wiped the dust from the dove with his thumb and placed it in Naomi's palm. Her fingers curled around the cool, smooth porcelain. "This isn't weak because it's chipped," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur. His eyes held hers, and in their hazel depths she saw a fierce, protective light. "It's beautiful because it's still here. It's been dropped, forgotten, left in the dark. But it's still a dove. It hasn't changed what it is." He held her gaze for a long moment, the air thick with everything that hadn't been said over the past 2 months. It was all there. The toast, the diapers, the rain-swept car ride, the shared silence. It was a conversation held in 100 small gestures, culminating in this one perfect truth. She looked at him, really looked at him, and a thought bloomed in her mind, clear and stunning. He looks at me like he's seeing a man, not a soldier, not a project. Just me. and I don't know what to do with that." But as her fingers tightened around the chipped dove, she realised she did know. For the first time in a very long time, she wanted to find out. The Sunday before Thanksgiving was always the busiest, a prelude to the holiday rush of loneliness and need. The kitchen hummed with a frantic energy, and by the time evening fell, a bone-deep weariness had settled over Naomi. A few elderly regulars, who had nowhere else to be, lingered over coffee, their quiet presence a comfort against the growing dark. Outside, another storm was brewing, the sky a churning canvas of charcoal and indigo. The wind began to howl, rattling the old windows of St. Jude's. Then, with a collective groan, the lights flickered twice and died. The kitchen was plunged into an absolute disorienting darkness. A few people gasped. An elderly woman, Gladys, let out a small, frightened cry. The hum of the refrigerators, the buzz of the fluorescent lights, all the familiar sounds were gone, replaced by the roar of the wind and the frantic beating of Naomi's own heart. She fumbled for her phone, its small screen a pathetic weapon against the oppressive dark. "It's okay," she called out, her voice less steady than she hoped. "Everyone stay calm. The emergency generator should kick on any second." It did. With a shudder and a cough, a few low-wattage emergency lights flickered to life, casting long, dancing shadows that made the familiar kitchen look menacing and strange. The generator chugged for a valiant 30 seconds, then sputtered, choked, and died, plunging them back into near-total blackness. That was when the panic began to set in. A low murmur of fear rippled through the room. Gladys began to weep quietly. Carlos, the young man who was always so hopeful, started pacing, his footsteps loud and anxious in the dark. Naomi felt a surge of adrenaline, but it was the frantic, helpless kind. Her domain of order had dissolved into chaos, and then a voice cut through the fear. It wasn't loud, it wasn't a shout, it was a calm, steady instrument of command. "Everyone, stay where you are." It was Micah. He was standing near the centre of the room, a solid silhouette against the faint light from the windows. The disquiet she sometimes saw in him was gone, replaced by a profound and absolute stillness. This was a language he knew. The noise in his head had gone silent, and in its place was a clear, sharp focus. He was no longer a volunteer, he was a Marine. "Naomi," he said, his voice finding her in the dark. "Where are the emergency flashlights?" "Pantry, top shelf on the right," she answered, her voice automatic. "Carlos, you're with me." He moved with purpose, his form a shadow among shadows. Within a minute, beams of light were cutting through the darkness. Micah directed the distribution with quiet authority. "Gladys, Mr. Henderson, you stay here by the main stove. It's the most sheltered spot. Maria, can you get the blankets from the storage closet? The one we just cleaned out?" He turned a chaotic group of frightened people into a unit. He didn't just give orders, he gave purpose. He created a pocket of safety in the heart of the storm. Naomi watched, not with fear, but with a dawning, breathtaking awe. This was the strength he'd kept hidden beneath his quiet humility. He wasn't just a man who could be gentle, he was a man who could be a rock. Just as a fragile calm settled over the room, the heavy kitchen doors were flung open, letting in a blast of wind, rain, and the flashing, strobing lights of an emergency vehicle. Framed in the doorway was Mark. He wore a bright yellow city response jacket, the picture of officialdom and control. His hair was perfectly styled, somehow immune to the storm. His eyes scanned the room, landing on Naomi with a practiced look of concern. "Nye, my God, I heard the power was out in this sector. I came as soon as I could." He strode into the room, his presence immediately sucking the air out of the fragile piece Micah had built. He completely ignored Micah, dismissing him with a glance as just another person in the room to be saved. "All right, everyone, "Listen up," Mark announced, his voice booming with performative authority. "I'm with the city's emergency response. We're going to get you all out of here and to a shelter." He started pointing, directing, his gestures grand and sweeping. He cornered Naomi near the pantry, his voice dropping to an intimate whisper. "Nay, come on," he murmured, his hand landing on her arm. It felt like a brand. "I messed up. I was an idiot, driven by ambition. But I've changed. Let me make it right. Let me be the hero for you again." It was everything the old Naomi would have wanted to hear. The slick apology, the promise of rescue, the chance to believe that a man could change. It was a beautiful, tempting lie. But her gaze drifted past his handsome, earnest face, across the flickering, candle-lit room. She saw Micah, not making a grand speech, but kneeling beside Gladys, tucking a blanket around her frail shoulders and speaking to her in a low, reassuring voice. He wasn't performing for an audience. He was just there. His actions were a quiet, steady rhythm against the chaotic symphony of Mark's empty words. The choice was suddenly, blindingly clear. It wasn't even a choice. It was an arrival. Naomi pulled her arm from Mark's grasp. She didn't say a word to him. She didn't need to. She walked across the room, her steps sure and steady on the cold floor, and stopped beside Micah. He looked up, his expression questioning. She put her hand on his arm, a quiet statement of allegiance, a silent anchor. "What do you need me to do next?" she asked, her voice clear and strong in the storm-tossed dark. The storm broke just before dawn. The wind gentled to a whisper, and the rain softened to a steady, cleansing drumbeat. One by one, the lights of Albuquerque flickered back to life, and with them, the power in St. Jude's. The harsh fluorescent lights of the kitchen hummed on, chasing away the last of the shadows and revealing the quiet aftermath of the night's chaos. Blankets were draped over chairs, empty coffee cups littered the tables, but everyone was safe. The last of their stranded guests had been taken home an hour ago. Now, there were only two of them. Naomi and Micah stood by the large kitchen window, a shared, bone-deep exhaustion settling between them. The sky to the east was beginning to pale, the deep indigo bleeding into a soft, hopeful grey. The city was washed clean, glistening under the emerging light. They had worked together through the night in a seamless, unspoken partnership, a dance of quiet competence that left no room for the ghosts of the past. The usual defences, the carefully maintained distances, had been stripped away by the crisis, leaving something raw and honest in their place. He turned to look at her, and in the clean new light of morning, she saw the same intensity she'd seen in the dusty storage room, but now it was unshielded, vulnerable, and directed entirely at her. The noise in his eyes was gone. In its place was a quiet, profound clarity. "I'm not a man of fancy words, Naomi," he began, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floor. "I don't know how to make big speeches or promises I can't keep. That's not how I'm built." He took a step closer, and she didn't move away. She felt as if she'd been waiting for this moment her entire life, without ever knowing it. "When I first came here," he continued, his gaze unwavering, "I was just looking for a place to be quiet, a place to do something that made sense, something that put more back into the world than it took out. I didn't expect to find this." He gestured vaguely between them, a small, helpless motion of his large hands. "I saw you, and you were like this place. Strong, real. You built a sanctuary here, not just with walls and a roof, but with your heart." Her breath caught in her throat. "I know what he told you," Micah said, his voice dropping even lower, fiercely gentle. "That your faith, your kindness, that it was a weakness. He was wrong. It's the strongest damn thing I've ever seen. It's a force. It's what held this place together last night. It's what holds it together every day." He finally broke his gaze from hers, looking out at the sunrise, painting the mountains in strokes of rose and gold. "I can't promise you poetry, Naomi, or a life without storms, but I can promise to show up. I can promise to be the man who butters the toast and buys the diapers and sits with you in the dark. I can offer you my Sundays and my Mondays and every day after that, if you'll have them. That's the only love I know how to give. The quiet kind. The kind that stays." Tears welled in Naomi's eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of recognition, of coming home. She didn't need a sweeping kiss or a dramatic, breathless confession. She didn't need a hero to rescue her. She just needed this, the steady, quiet truth of this man. She closed the small space between them and, with a sense of final, peaceful surrender, leaned her head against his shoulder. His arm came around her instantly, holding her close, and she felt the solid, steady rhythm of his breathing. His flannel shirt smelled of coffee and rain and a deep, comforting stillness. He wasn't a grand gesture. He was 100 small kindnesses. He wasn't a lightning strike. He was the sunrise. And for the first time in a very long time, Naomi wasn't afraid of the silence. She was home in it. Love, she learned, wasn't a sudden storm to be survived. It was the quiet light that returned, without fail, every morning after,